Good morning and welcome to Thursday. It is the Thursday of Holy Week, and normally I'd be preparing for a big Maundy Thursday service right about now, probably involving food of some sort, which, being Methodist, that kind of comes with the territory. But instead this morning I want us to take a look at someplace different. Well, not really someplace different, but let's take a different look at the story that we find of the original, of the first Last Supper. I'm not sure how those words are supposed to go together, but they do. We're going to be in Luke chapter 22, just all of it for this story. There are so many little pieces that are taking place to this story, it's hard to kind of just pick out specific ones. So we're just going to be in all of Luke chapter 2 from verse 1 to through verse 46. And the first place we're going to start is where we've been starting all week, and that is the reminder, and this becomes even more important as we get to the end of Holy Week, is that we know how this story ends. We know Easter morning is coming, and so I invite us to read this story knowing that that is going to take place, remembering that for all that we're going to see, we know that Sunday morning is still on its way. And so we're starting with where this story really begins. This is the story of the Last Supper is one of urgency and preparation. The first part of the chapter, verses 1 to 6, are of the religious leaders and others that are preparing to try and arrest Jesus. They're getting things ready. They're turning Judas. They're doing all that stuff so that they can catch Jesus out. The disciples, on the other hand, are also preparing, but the difference is they are preparing in Jesus' direction. Jesus is telling them to go and to get ready, to make preparations for this, and they are doing as directed. And that's really important to note that there's a distinction there, because one of the things that this tells us is that we have to prepare. We don't just sit back and wait for things to happen, that we are preparing. The question for us is, who do we follow in those preparations? Whose lead do we follow? Do we follow our own? Do we follow Jesus's? Do we do something else? That's the question we have to answer. So often I see, sometimes we get caught up and say, well, I'm just going to wait on Jesus, or I'm just going to wait for this, or Jesus has me covered, and then we don't do anything. The problem is that we always should be preparing. The question that we have to answer is, whose lead are we following? If we're following in the right place, then our preparations will make sense. And we're going to see that play out more as the story goes on. And so that's where we're starting. And then we get later into verse 14. And Jesus, now they're into the Last Supper. They're in the upper room. And Jesus is continuing to prepare the disciples. Now he is teaching. He is preparing them for the long haul. He's not directing them to do anything, but he is teaching them so that they can be prepared for what is to come. And he does this very differently than we might expect otherwise, because he gives them the bread and the wine. We have the very first communion service that happens there in that upper room with the disciples, and Jesus is giving this to them. Even Judas is receiving the bread and the wine. Judas receives the very first communion. It's after that that in Luke's gospel we are shown his leaving. Or in Luke's gospel we're told that Judas is going to betray him, or Jesus says the one who is here is going to betray me. The other gospels, this is where we see Judas get up and leave after this. But Judas is served communion. Even Jesus knowing what he is going to do, Judas is given grace. I'm not going to address that. I just want you to let that sink in as we go through this story. But then he continues on. And the end of this passage is they've gotten to the garden and Jesus is praying. He's preparing his disciples, and he tells them this crazy thing. He says, I want you to go, but I want you to take your wallet. I want you to take your shirt. Let me make sure I get the right things here. Take your wallet, take a bag, and take a sword. Now this, and one of the disciples comes back and says, I'll take 2 swords. Won't give you my best count off of Sesame Street impression at this point, but you get the picture on that one. They're thinking, 2 swords is better than 1. And I think Jesus is sitting back saying, y'all are dangerous enough with 1 sword. I don't need you to be Barney Fife and taking a second one, thinking you're going to do something more with that. Just take 1, that's fine. But they were so overexcited because they were wanting this story to play out according to what they expected. But Jesus is preparing them for something different. And this is, when he tells them to take these things, this is in direct contrast to where earlier in the gospel, Jesus has told them when he sent them out the first time, said, don't take anything, don't take any money, don't take any change of clothes, don't take all this other stuff. Let others go and provide for you. But now he's saying, now go take these things, helping them to know that this time it's going to be different. And so you need to prepare differently, follow his lead. And then I'm starting to get myself out of order. He does that in the upper room, and then they go to the garden and he prays. And Jesus prays in the garden, even knowing what is still to come later that night. That's where this part of the story ends, is with him praying. This is where the story is slowing down for a moment. It's like this calm before the storm. Jesus has come in, he has spent time teaching, he's done other things. And now we get to the Last Supper, and he has spent, we can see it's almost like the night is winding down, coming to a calm, centered place before things explode into action again. Jesus is getting them ready. Even while others are plotting his demise, Jesus is still teaching them and preparing them for what is to come. He is showing them how to take time, to be together, and most importantly, to put needs ahead of self. What are the needs that need to be addressed versus what of ourselves do we need to put first? And not just immediate needs, but long-term needs. Because this is the thing that we're going to see what Jesus is doing. He's not just preparing them for the short term, for what is immediately coming, but he is preparing them for the long term, to address long-term needs that they are going to have. They don't know this yet, but that's what he's doing. He is getting them ready to address those needs. Even when it means putting others ahead of him, even when it means directing his disciples even to put others ahead of themselves, he's preparing them for that longer journey. Because the question is, what happens if we don't do that? Because this is the study and contrast that we find in this story between the religious leaders and the disciples, where Jesus directs the disciples to put the needs ahead of themselves. The religious leaders are putting themselves ahead of the needs. And what we see is that when we put ourselves ahead, especially in this story, the religious leaders, the other leaders put themselves ahead of everything else, thinking that they can handle this, whatever comes. The trouble is that Jerusalem still gets destroyed. Jerusalem gets flattened, and any authority and power that they would have once had is gone in that moment. What they do to Jesus is normal. It's expected even. There are no surprises there. But what they don't know is that they are harming themselves by doing that, because they are putting themselves ahead of the needs of everything else. They've established this whole culture that is toxic and that is harsh and that is, whether they know it or not, is going to come crumbling down around themselves because it can only be sustained so long when you don't actually address what's important, when you're only putting yourself first. When we put ourselves before the needs, we will lose. And we'll lose because there's always going to be something out there that's bigger than ourselves. Even if that thing that is bigger than us is the size of a virus. Easter is the hope that lets us do what is needed. This is what lets us put ourselves in second place, because we know that Easter gives us hope, that we can suffer even in the short term because we know how the story ends. We know that we can work to address the needs of the moment and of this time, and we can prepare for the long term, even if that means that we suffer on our own, that we suffer ourselves for a time, but we know that Easter is coming. And that for me is the most important part, that we remember that whatever we face now, we have that sure and certain knowledge that Easter is around the corner. And so, let me ask you this question as we finish up for today. Knowing this, how are you going to prepare differently? How do you prepare differently when we look to put needs ahead of self, when we look to longer term, that we look to Easter knowing that we can follow Jesus' lead, even if that means that things may be hard in the short term, but that can be overcome because we always have that hope for what is coming? Take that question with you today. Go in peace, and we'll see you back here tomorrow morning. Amen.